Hello, and thank you very much for coming along. Today we're going to look at the further implications of the Green Revolution around the world, particularly at a group called AGRA and the African Agricultural Narrative. This is part 5 of an ongoing series examining the impact of the Green Revolution, not only where it started in Mexico, Pakistan, and India, but throughout the world. You'll remember the characters. Norman Borlaug began much of the work in this area, and he's been succeeded by a series of agricultural economists and national budget economists, people who look at agriculture as a sector of the economy, and in fact even refer to it as an agricultural industry, uh, as a sector of the national economy. They've become the most strong advocates of what might be called the Borlaug tradition of applying petrochemical science to the development of mass scale agriculture. On the other hand, there have been critics that have emerged that you've seen in previous programs that have been looking at the way the increased dependence on petroleum in agriculture is dangerous. And recently, that's focused its activity in Africa, where there's a struggle, in effect, to promote the Green Revolution technology on the one hand through a group called AGRA, Agricultural Research for Africa. And the resistance to that group has become manifest throughout several countries. And now several scientific studies have been made to examine it very carefully. So we'll be looking tonight at these issues of, once again, who speaks for science? And in particular, which science is being foregrounded? Is it the technology of crop manipulation, fertilizer subsidies, and mechanical agriculture? Or is it the science of agroecology based on sustainability models, soil conservation and soil building, and looking at the nutritional impact of agriculture, not just its gross figures of production? Furthermore, the question of who speaks for which farmers is absolutely crucial. The agricultural sector in any economy is very diverse, and it usually is involved in a trend toward something and a trend away from something else. That means different kinds of farmers will weigh in with different attitudes towards what's being proposed and projected for future plans in agriculture. Who doesn't get listened to in the discussion of national agricultural policy? This is true around the world, not just in developing countries, but certainly in the industrial countries as well. So these are some of the issues we're going to be looking at in detail. Who speaks for science and which science, and who speaks for which farmers? We can start by asking, what is AGRA? AGRA, in fact, is the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, and it was founded in 2006 with the goal of bringing high-yield agricultural practices to 30 million smallholder farmer households. With the adoption of commercial seeds and inorganic fertilizer, AGRA set out to double crop productivity and incomes while halving food insecurity by the year 2020. As AGRA reached its self-declared deadline, for these ambitious goals in 2020, how well has AGRA done in increasing productivity, farmer incomes, and food security? Well, let's look first at what's behind the funding of AGRA. AGRA has received roughly $1 billion in funding, two-thirds of it from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and dispersed more than $500 million in grants, mainly in 13 priority African countries. The Green Revolution Technology Campaign has been supported during this time by international programs far larger than AGRA, and notably by national governments in Africa, which have spent roughly $1 billion per year on programs that subsidize the purchase of commercial seeds and fertilizers. Well, we can take a look at their own publicity, their own, as it were, presentation of themselves to the world. Let's have a look.
It is said that fortune favors the bold. Changing the fortunes of millions of Africans requires not just a bold vision, but an equally audacious mission. This is why at AGRA, we're boldly charging into new territory, testing new molds, pioneering new partnerships. We speak truth to power. We celebrate new steps, and we stand tall in our resolve that a green revolution in Africa holds the power to release Africa's potential in all its glory. At AGRA, we will empower. We will stand out. We will innovate. We will aspire. We will lead. We will transform. It's what we do. It's who we are. It's what we will stand for and be known for at AGRA.
Do you mind? You're stepping on my beans. My mother used to use this. And her mother. And before that, more mothers, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. It could have been the exact same one for all I know. People say Africa is a continent of tomorrow. To me, this seems a lot like yesterday. But it doesn't have to be this way. Farming can be more than an existence. It can be a business. We don't have to just survive. We can thrive. Let me show you what I mean. This is Faustina. Faustina learned how to plant the right kind of peas. These new pigeon peas are drought resistant. They prevent erosion and they fetch a higher price than ordinary beans. Trees fix nitrogen into the soil so that other crops can thrive. They make a very good team. And Tura here follows a technique called microdosing, applying small and affordable doses of fertilizer to the spots where it's most needed. His yields have been fantastic, and he's sharing this knowledge with all his neighbors. You see, in Africa, we farm very hard. We break our backs sometimes for very little. We just need to farm smarter. Follow me. Crops will always face danger from diseases. But these people are crop scientists. They work both here in the lab and outside in the field, looking for ways to make the seeds disease-resistant. And our smarter farming doesn't always have to be so scientific. Look at this ugly thing. Cassava is an important crop, but once it's picked, you have 72 hours before it's useless. But this machine gives us time. Once it's chipped and dried, the cassava is good for 24 months. It means we no longer have to accept the price that someone will pay at the farm gate. We can control and manage the harvest. Now we can set the price. Sabrina, naongea na nani? Ah, banana man. She used to take these bananas 10 kilometers to the market, and then she learnt about business and about cultivation. Now, the banana man comes, picks them up, and takes them to the market for her. She used to earn less than $100 a month. Now she earns $360. There are more mobile phones in Africa than in Europe or in the US. The M-Farm network uses this technology, and now the whole process works from right here. With a call or a text, farmers can get together and form cooperatives, pooling their collective strengths and doing business on their terms. Just a little education has helped banana farmers sell 176,000 tons of bananas for $22 million.
It's about seeing how it's all connected. We start with good seeds. We put good seeds into good soil. We use good knowledge to get good produce. And if we have good access to the market, we can sell it at a good price.
You see, none of this is useful in isolation. If we get stuck at borders, our produce won't be good anymore. One country can have a surplus and its neighbor can have none. Change in policy means we can now keep our produce moving. Everything must work together. Hizi ni kutoka Sabina.
Kutoka Sabina.
These are 30 kilos of top quality bananas.
Sawa.
I want the good price, huh?
Nakutengenezea bei.
Agriculture is in Africa's soul and is at the heart of our development. When people make profit from their work, they can put that money into their children's education, better housing, better transport, nutrition, and healthcare. When our farmers do better, we all do better. We can farm our way into prosperity. There is no reason why Africa can't feed itself and help to feed the world. We are part of a revolution, a new green revolution. We are AGRA. AGRA works through every stage of the process, from getting the small farmer started financially to helping him prosper in the marketplace. The success we've had has come from our collaboration. We need partnerships with the public and private sector. Our problems belong to all of us, and so can the solutions. We must all work together for a success that we can all share. Join us on our march towards a green revolution.
Who could possibly object? A green revolution. It's a very interesting choice of words. The march towards a green revolution in Africa, giving green a very different name than the usual phrase, green revolution, which had to do with the application of petro-intensive agriculture. This is trying to use green in the sense of a growing green revolution, which assists the small farmer in every respect, providing finance, providing appropriate machines, providing new seeds. They're referred to as new seeds. Well, it's a very upbeat story by a woman who doesn't do much agriculture herself, but has become very adept through funders to talk about it in the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Put out back in 2013. Now, you can find out more of these things from their YouTube website. In fact, they have an impressive array of media outreach efforts to inform the world about what they've been doing. But the critiques have been coming forward And by the year 2020, which was the target year that they set for themselves, a number of people have looked at what they've been doing. And Tim Wise in particular has been writing papers, bringing his research to the public. One entitled Failing Africa's Farmers is pretty scathing in its assessment. Subtitle is An Impact Assessment of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And he's found out, in trying to find out more about it, that there are, in fact, many internal documents within AGRA that have been withheld from the public because they too have some misgivings about the achievements of their own program. It's legitimate to ask, what has AGRA accomplished? Well, according to Tim Wise, there's little publicly available documentation of impacts from AGRA, the Gates Foundation, or donor governments that have supported these initiatives as well. He says there is no evidence AGRA is reaching a significant number of smallholder farmers. Productivity has increased just 29% over 12 years for maize, the most subsidized and supported crop. This falls well short of doubling yields, which would be an 100% increase if they were doubled. Overall, staple crop yields have grown only 18% over 12 years. Meanwhile, undernourishment, as measured by the Food and Agricultural Organization, has increased 30% in AGRA countries, countries where the group AGRA has been working. These poor indicators of performance suggest that AGRA and its funders should change course. This has been made more dramatic by a report he issued in 2020 called False Promises. As it says as a subtitle, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa has, in effect, come through with a lot of false promises.
This project has been a long time coming. I began researching the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa when I was researching my book, Eating Tomorrow, which came out last year. But we really wanted to update that, and that research, which was commissioned by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Foundation and other allies, has resulted in a background paper of mine, and in the report False Promises, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which came out last month. So what I want to do briefly is highlight the main findings from that report to open the discussion with our panelists. Next slide. So as I said, this was published by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Foundation with a coalition of German and African groups listed here. They also commissioned case studies for the report on Kenya, Mali, Zambia, and Tanzania. And as I said, my research laid the background for essentially doing an impact assessment of whether AGRA and the larger Green Revolution project was bringing anything resembling our Green Revolution to Africa in terms of the goals AGRA set initially. Next slide. As Nemo said, the organization AGRA was founded in 2006 with funding from the Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundations. Since then, it's gotten about $1 billion in funding, about 2/3 of that from the Gates Foundation, and made about half of that, used about half of that funding in grants to different countries who are participants in AGRA. These 13 in this list were the main ones that AGRA has funded. Right now, there are only 11. Niger and Zambia were not in AGRA, and now Zambia is considering rejoining. But this gives a sense of the level of grants that have been dispersed since 2006 through 2018. The goals AGRA set were that by 2020, I'm sorry, back to the previous slide. Yeah, the goals it set were to double productivity and double incomes for 30 million small-scale farming households in Africa, in its target countries, and to cut food security in half. We made a point in this report of not just focusing on AGRA itself, because it's very difficult to discern much of any direct impacts from AGRA's own work. But it is part of a much larger Green Revolution project. We would say it's driving the policy narrative for African governments. And those governments have provided as much as $1 billion a year in subsidies for the purchases of the commercial seeds and chemical fertilizers that AGRA is promoting. So it's not just the 1 billion from AGRA that is driving this. It is dramatically the support of African governments. Next slide, please. So quickly, the main findings. We found no evidence of 100% increase in productivity. That would be a doubling of productivity. Even for maize, which is a favored crop, favored by AGRA for its promotion and favored by input subsidy programs. Most of these programs go to support the purchase of seeds and fertilizers for maize. But productivity is only up 29% compared to a 100% goal. In a broader basket of staple crops, you see only an 18% increase in productivity. This is slow by any standards. This is very slow productivity growth. We also found that the subsidies that were being provided expanded the land planted to the favored crops more than it expanded yields. That's a problem because the goal of sustainable intensification, as it's called, is to get more food out of the land that's already planted and not increase the ecological footprint of agriculture on new lands. We found no evidence of incomes doubling. Poverty was still high and in most of these countries, and dramatically no evidence of improved food security. According to FAO figures, there was a 31% increase in the number of undernourished people in the 13 AGRA countries. Only 4 AGRA countries showed a decline, and in 9, the number of hungry actually increased. The conclusion of the study is that the Green Revolution model has had 14 years to prove itself, and it's failing. We think agroecology offers much more. It offers lower costs to governments and to farmers, and the farmers will see higher net returns because their input costs are not so high. They'll get diverse and more nutritious crops and diets for their food security, and it'll restore soils and provide other environmental benefits. Next slide. So this is what it looks like. Again, the first 2 bars are AGRA's goals: 100% increase in productivity, a 50% decrease in food insecurity. What they've actually achieved is an 18% increase in productivity, and not a decrease, but an increase in undernourishment. So next slide. This tells a story. I think the basic story that we'd want to tell about how the different ways this is failing. You see the goal of doubling productivity for maize. Total production has increased in AGRA countries by about 87% in this time period. And you could say, well, that's getting close to doubling. But the goal was not to double production, it was to double productivity. That darker green bar is the yield growth, the portion of that production increase that has come from productivity growth, and it's very low. The lighter green shows how much new land has been planted in maize, mainly because of the incentives given to farmers to cultivate maize. You give farmers free seeds and fertilizer to grow something, and they'll take it and they'll put new land into production to do it. They will also take land out of more sustainable and nutritious crops like millet and sorghum. So those next two bars show that millet production has declined. 24% millet yields have gone down 21%, and a lot of that land has gone into maize. Sorghum is a similar story. There's been virtually no yield growth. And again, we created our staple yield index, which combined a set of staple crops, cereal crops, and roots and tubers like sweet potato, cassava, to measure more broadly than maize. And that showed, only an 18% increase in AGRA countries. And again, the most astonishing figure is that undernourishment number, 30% increase in the number of undernourished people, according to the FAO, moving things in exactly the opposite direction. Next slide, please. Next slide. This is particularly alarming, the finding that there's a declining cultivation of traditional and nutritious crops. This graphic shows the difference between maize and millet, which I just described, a 24% decrease in millet production with an 87% increase in maize production. But it's not only that product that has suffered with the incentives to maize. Cassava has gone down 16%, 6% in yields, roots and tubers 7%.
Well, you can see why it was entitled False Promises, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. AGRA has yielded some false promises. In addition to that report, Tim Wise published the year before a larger study indicting the agro-tech of high petroleum-dependent agriculture, entitled Eating Tomorrow, a very interesting title. And he reflects a bit on how the title came about in conversations with Francis Moore-Lappé. Let's have a look.
I think we're one of the things that we're really pleased about the book is the title, Eating Tomorrow, and it actually comes with a story that is entirely true, even though it doesn't sound it. About 3 years ago, when I had my first book proposal, and before I was working with Frances Moore-Lappé at the Small Planet Institute in Cambridge, I asked her if she would give me advice on a book proposal, and she very graciously said yes. We met for lunch in Cambridge. She gave me very good advice, which again really shaped the book. And what you will read is it very much has her imprint. But we brainstormed a title. I didn't have a working title that I liked, and we brainstormed titles. She's very good at titles, so that was. But we still came out with nothing we liked. I was walking home. My cell phone rings. I answer the phone, it's Frankie, and I say, "Hi, Frankie," and she says, "Hey, Tim, how about eating tomorrow?" And I literally said, "Well, I really enjoyed our lunch, Frankie, and I guess we could do it tomorrow." And she said, no, your title, your book, Eating Tomorrow, the title. True story, and that's how we ended up with Eating Tomorrow. I think what I particularly like about it, and I think resonates, is that it really captures the double meaning. The double meaning captures the real essence of what I was trying to communicate, which is that humanity does indeed face a continuing challenge to ensure that everyone can eat today. And climate change makes that challenge all the more daunting about making sure everyone can eat tomorrow. But the way we're producing our food is on chemical-intensive industrial scale farms is quite literally devouring the natural resources, the seeds, the land, the soil, the climate, the water, on which future food production depends. By continuing and now even expanding such unsustainable production methods, we are eating our collective tomorrows. And the powers that be, far from shifting away from that kind of a damaging farming model, are instead promoting ever more industrial scale agriculture, as Mark was saying. And that's all under the banner of feeding a hungry world with rising populations, the same old neo-Malthusian mantra that we've heard for years. I wrote this book because with 30 years in this field, I wanted to understand why policymakers were ignoring all the low-cost solutions all around them, offered by their own small-scale farmers. And instead, they're pushing expensive policies that not only fail to help the hungry eat today, they are undermining the capacity of all of us to eat tomorrow. The subtitle of the book summarizes basically my diagnosis, agribusiness, family farmers, and the battle for the future of food. There is definitely a battle for the future of food. I saw it waged all over the world. Agribusiness firms have largely hijacked the policy agenda nearly everywhere I traveled. And if we want to ensure that everyone enjoys the right to food, as Mark pointed out, that everyone can eat tomorrow, we need to place family farmers at the center of that discussion, helping them feed their families, their communities, their countries, while they nourish the planet. That's the central finding of this book. The question, how will we feed the world? I'm really glad Mark went off on that. I go off on it too. It's an important question. I mean, we have to recognize that there are challenges to in a world of climate change that we all have to address. But it's kind of a good question with a lot of bad answers. And those bad answers, more often than not, focus on the need to grow more food commodities everywhere in the world. We just need to grow more food. That is as wrong today as it was when Francis Moore Lappé first wrote it in Diet for a Small Planet, that hunger is not the product of scarcity of food. And it's equally true today. Just last year, Reuters, within the course of 1 week, Reuters reported that the world is experiencing a global grain glut, that there's grains piling up outside silos and rotting for lack of markets for them. And yet at the same time, the UN reports that we've seen a 5% uptick in the incidence of chronic malnutrition, with another billion people, over 800 million facing chronic malnutrition, and another 1 billion facing some form of malnutrition. So it's hunger amid plenty, just like we've seen. The beat goes on. And why do we keep getting it so wrong, thinking that growing more food is going to solve that problem? It never has, and it never will. And that's because, as Mark said, the question, how will we feed the world, is just fundamentally flawed and deeply arrogant, in fact, because the presumption, of course, is that the advanced developed countries are the ones who are going to feed the world with our modern agriculture, our high yield production. But nothing could be further from the truth. 70% of the food consumed in developing countries where hunger is the worst is grown in those countries. They are the ones growing the food. As Vandana highlights in her book, in the title of her book, Who Really Feeds the World, she's trying to go straight after that question, and it's an important one. But the other piece of this is that there's no abstract world out there waiting to be fed. They're not passively sitting around out there being hungry. There's about 1 billion people who are deeply hungry, and the majority of them are in agricultural communities and are in small-scale farming communities. And that is the obvious paradox. Food producers suffering some of the worst hunger. Well, the obvious answer is to put food producers in a better position to grow more of their own food and sustain their communities and their families. But as I saw in country after country in the course of this research, policymakers are doing no such thing. Why are they doing no such thing? Well, my conclusion was that it would cut into agribusiness profits just about everywhere. How would it do that? Well, let me count the ways, or at least share a few of the ways that you'll find in Eating Tomorrow. I mean, land grabbing is probably the most egregious and maybe the one that that's grabbed the most headlines. In that, it's a term that refers to cash-strapped governments in poor countries giving away land to foreign investors in the hopes that those investors will provide a shortcut to modern farming, to high-yield agriculture. They rarely do. I followed in Mozambique in southern Africa, which is a particular target of land grabbing. I followed a Chinese rice company that was granted a long-term lease on 50,000 acres of irrigated land in a town called Xai-Xai, about 3 hours up the coast from the capital city of Maputo. Company no sooner got the lease than they plowed right through farmers' fields. This land was not unoccupied. They always say it's unoccupied. It never is. Plowed right through the fields. Angelica Moyane, one of the leaders in the community, told about how watching bulldozers plow up her ripe corn plants. She and other farmers protested, which is one other thing you see everywhere, is resistance. And they actually forced the company to withdraw from many of those lands that they'd taken. But now the project is failing on its own terms. It's just not a productive project like many of these are. I saw graveyards of land grabs all over the world. And that leaves the lands undeveloped again and off limits to the local producers. So what do the farmers want, I asked. You would be surprised how rarely anybody asks farmers, what do you want? I ask people all the time, well, what do you want? In this case, they said, one leader told me, just give all the land back to the communities. Like, duh, this is what we want. And local farmers in Xai-Xai are taking steps to actually make that happen. They formed a new association. They named Tsakane, which in their local language means happy. And they've petitioned for 750 acres of land that will let their members grow more food. The women of Xai-Xai show us the way if we will listen. It's not clear who's listening, but the question is obvious. If you want to feed the hungry, why not give good land to food producers to grow more food? It's a good question for the government of Zambia, which I studied quite a bit. 78% of Zambians, rural residents, are in extreme poverty, and the government has carved out 250,000 acre farm blocks for foreign investors. Wilfred Monga has 12 acres of land and some cattle in southern province in Zambia. He's a relatively prosperous farmer by Zambian standards, and his kids his family didn't seem poor. But he told me he worries that his children, particularly his girls, won't have enough land to support the family because land gets divided within families. Imagine, though, in this land-rich country, one 250,000 acre farm block could provide 25,000 land-poor farmers with 10 acres each. 10 acres would be plenty. Plenty to support a family, plenty to grow a surplus and sell a surplus and have some cash income, to invest in their farms, plenty to send their kids to school. And that's what agricultural development looks like. It always has, and it will continue to look like that. And with that kind of bottom-up progress, you're actually addressing the so-called population problem, because with progress, economic progress, comes reduced population growth, particularly if you focus on empowering girls and educating girls. So far, that's not what the Zambian government is doing. Large firms and local elites are reaping the profits. Another agribusiness-friendly policy that I saw in much of southern Africa was the so-called Green Revolution for Africa, which Mark also mentioned. This is a well-funded attempt to increase farm production by pushing commercial seeds and synthetic fertilizers. Governments put scarce public funds, in some cases as much as 60% of their entire agricultural budgets, in subsidies so small farmers can purchase from the private sector seeds and fertilizers. I start the book, in fact, in Malawi with the so-called Malawi miracle. It's called the Malawi miracle because the government got fed up with being told they couldn't subsidize anything by the World Bank and the IMF, and they decided to do these subsidies. And they actually worked for a while. They saw increases in corn production that were quite significant for a few years. But it only worked for a short while. Synthetic fertilizers did nothing for the long-term fertility of the soil, which is planted year after year after year in corn, partly because that's what the government is subsidizing. They're giving you subsidies for seeds to grow corn. So you get monoculture corn drenched in fertilizer. Pouring fertilizer onto monocrop corn is like putting trout in a pond every spring. You can get some, you can pull some trout from that pond in the summer. And sure, farmers can pull some corn from their land. But the land is no more capable of sustaining life than it was before the season started. It actually grows more acidic, less capable of producing food. Yields plateau. It then takes farmers more and more fertilizer just to get the same level of production. And most farmers can't afford the fertilizer. Today, Malawi shows scarcely any evidence of a reduction in rural hunger. Meanwhile, though, and again, farmers show the way, enterprising farm groups there are have improved a local variety of corn that they've been growing for years and years and years. Careful seed selection made it more productive. It's high in vitamin A, which is very much in demand and very much needed in the diets of people in the area. But they don't have to buy those seeds every year from Monsanto or another seed company, and they don't have to buy fertilizer to drench it each year to make it grow. They interplant a variety of crops mixed together. That improves soils. It diversifies their families' diets, right? Families aren't just pulling corn out of the ground every year and eating only corn. They're eating a variety of vegetables and other nutritious crops. And it also helps them withstand climate shocks, because if a drought kills their corn or a pest kills their corn, other crops are there to survive and feed the family. I heard farmer after farmer sing the praises of this agroecological farming that they're doing, and they're now beginning to sell that vitamin A-rich corn to neighboring farms and to aid agencies. But what does the government do? It drafts a seed policy that strengthens the rights of commercial plant breeders and threatens the rights of these same farmers to save, exchange, and sell their own seeds. Why? Because the policy says only certified seeds can be sold. They in fact say, and this shocked me, that these seeds, which farmers have been using for generations, can't even be called seeds. They can only be called grain, worthy of eating but not planting. How can such nutritious corn, which we have planted for generations, not be a seed? One farmer said to me. I was actually arguing with one of the defenders of the policy in Malawi, and exasperated, I said, the way this policy reads, it could have been written by Monsanto. And after a long pause, he looked at me and said very sheepishly, well, one former Monsanto official was a co-author of the policy. I was shocked. I wrote about it. My report of Monsanto's bald-faced conflict of interest in this issue prompted an outcry and some reforms to the seed policy, I'm glad to say. But the scary thing is that the companies and their philanthropic allies, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have their sights set on, quote unquote, opening Africa to the seed giants for commercial seeds, including GMOs. And that's been dubbed in places like Malawi, the new colonialism. It is very much a colonial undertaking. They have certainly succeeded in capturing most African governments with their funds, with their campaigns, and with their pressure. In the capital city of Lilongwe in Malawi, I saw farmer Evelyn Jolomole from this community that was growing the orange maize, displaying it and some of the products they make from it in an exhibition on adaptation to climate change. And the president of Malawi, actually, Peter Mutharika, actually came to her booth. This farmer from Lobi in central Malawi had the opportunity to speak with the president. And when she handed him a bag of this beautiful bright orange maize flour, he said to her, "Oh, is this from Monsanto?" I thought immediately of the monoculture of the mind that Vandana has written about so eloquently. It's such a narrowing of our thinking to the stifling of our imaginations. Evelyn was actually on TV that night explaining that no, to the president, that no, this was actually a freely available natural resource that could solve Malawi's food security problems. I actually had a lot of interactions with Monsanto that you'll read about in the book. My most intense was in Mexico, where the company has been trying to get permission to grow genetically modified corn there, despite the very real dangers of cross-pollination with Mexico's rich heritage of native maize varieties. Local farmers there called it genetic pollution, of course, and they actually won an injunction to stop the seed companies from planting GMOs in Mexico, an injunction that has held for 5 years. I was surprised that I got an interview with Monsanto in the course of this. It turned into a 5-hour meeting with 6 company executives that I can only describe as surreal. It's described in detail in the book. I'll just give you a snippet. They started out by saying that Mexico would starve without Monsanto seeds, GMO seeds, which obviously wasn't true. They just had their biggest yield increases in decades without them. And the yields on GMO crops aren't any better anyway, so just pure propaganda. But they went on to tell me that that they wanted to introduce GM corn to help Mexico achieve food sovereignty. This was the term they used, food sovereignty, coming out of Monsanto's mouth. I don't know if you all know the word food sovereignty or the term, but it's the rallying cry from peasant farmers around the world to protect themselves from companies like Monsanto. Food sovereignty is all about maintaining local and national control. Later, when I told farm leader Victor Suarez about my conversation, he was just outraged. He told me, "Our problems are complex. GMOs are simple. Our problems will not be solved by a single gene." I couldn't agree more, and I am really glad to report one of the many reasons I can find hope in the course of this story is that Victor Suarez is now Subsecretary of Agriculture for Food Self-Sufficiency in the new government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, which took office in December last year. And López Obrador has announced his intention to ban the cultivation of GM crops in Mexico. Not surprisingly, though, agribusiness influence is the strongest in the United States. And I found that in Iowa. I wrote about Iowa in a section that's titled "The Roots of Our Problems." Iowa is blanketed in corn and soybeans, dotted with factory hog farms and ethanol refineries, and struggling to keep its water clean from all of the runoff of the chemicals. And there I met Matt Liebman, a brilliant Iowa State scientist who has been trying to nibble at the edges. How do we make this behemoth of an agriculture more sustainable? How do we make it less damaging? And he's shown that the simple incorporation of an added rotation of grasses into the normal corn and then soy and then corn and then soy rotation of crops would have enormous benefits. It would reduce fertilizer use by 85%. It would eliminate water pollution from runoff. It would reduce soil erosion and improve soil fertility. And it would do that all by maintaining the profitability and the productivity of the farm. I said, what more could you want? That's the win-win-win solution everyone's looking for, right? I asked him how many farmers were using his system. Almost none, he told me. I could not have devised a program that affected more of the state's agribusinesses. Think about this. 85% fertilizer reduction, reduced fertilizer sales for the companies. Growing less corn and soybeans because you added this new crop rotation. Fewer seed sales and herbicide sales for Monsanto. possible small increases in corn and soy prices, the basis of feed for livestock firms, higher costs for Smithfield, Tyson, and other factory farms, higher corn costs for ADM for its ethanol refineries. Agribusiness basically put a veto on these policies. So the obstacles to these kinds of reforms are indeed daunting, and I saw that everywhere. But I also saw a lot of reason for hope. And actually, I'll close just by, because I think every book reading should have a reading, right? By reading, promising that it's not actually a spoiler. You don't need a spoiler alert for this, because I think you know how it ends. Reading the conclusion to the book. The good news is that in the battle for the future of food, farmer resistance is strong, and so are farmers' alternatives, many advanced under the banner of food sovereignty. In Malawi, farmers and their allies resist the imposition of a seed policy drafted by Monsanto, and they pursue an independent path using their own improved seeds in soils, growing more fertile with their agroecological practices. In Mozambique, farming communities defend their hard-won land rights from land grabs while promoting climate-resilient farms. Zambians fight for a just national land policy that recognizes women's rights. Women's rights to secure village land and demands limits on corrupt land deals that give the best lands to foreigners and the rich. In India, the Right to Food movement defends its National Food Security Act against hypocritical trade complaints from the United States, pushing for grassroots rural development in the world's hungriest country. In Mexico, farmers and their allies sustain a multi-year resistance to the forced adoption of genetically modified maize, promote a transition to agroecology, and elect a president who might just reverse the trade and agricultural policies that have undermined small-scale farmers. And even in Iowa, residents demand clean water from more sustainable farming practices, livable communities not polluted by factory farms, and checks on the control agribusiness exerts over government policies in the state. All are striving for the same thing, the right of everyone to eat safe and healthy food today, while ensuring that we steward our natural wealth so we can all eat tomorrow. Thank you.